All right, ladies and gentlemen, I do believe that we are live. There we go. Sup, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to each and every one of you. It is, of course, Thursday, 12 o'clock, the 18th of June. And this is the first stream we've done for the week because on Tuesday we had Youth Day, and there's a lot that needs to be discussed there. Stefan, how you doing, sir? And we'll talk a little bit about Youth Day. Uh, eh, there's some interesting stuff happening all across the world, but I think what's going to be dominating the news cycle, at least it should be dominating the news cycle for a time, is the rape gang report or the grooming gang report, as many people have euphemistically tried to call it, because apparently being honest about what happened in the UK is just impossible. Moreover, I think what's sad about this report is that it isn't dominating the news cycle. When you look across the world, news organizations everywhere, almost none of them are covering this story. The politicians that were or were not involved in a lot of this stuff and the covering up of it, they're now condemning the inquiry report, saying no, there's absolutely nothing wrong here. So I do think that it's important that people with some principles and morals and independent media, like YouTubers, like myself, that we talk about this because no one else seems interested in doing so. David, how you doing, sir? Knight of Justice, how you doing? I hope your back is feeling better today. Tokoloshi, how you doing, sir? Peter Pan, how are you? And welcome to every single one of you that is chatting. Johan, how you doing, sir? That is chatting, but or that might not be chatting because you're busy working, but still, nevertheless, you are here. Now, I think we should just jump in straight away on this report and talk a little bit about it. What I will not be doing in today's stream is going into victim testimony. And there's a reason why doing it during a live stream could be incredibly bad. There's a lot of testimony, and I haven't even read the entirety of the report yet. It's 200 odd pages, I think 209 pages. It's a lot of reading. But the testimonies that I have read, some of them are gruesome. And I do actually commend them for going into detail about exactly what happened to them. Also important to note that every single one of the victim testimonies is in their own words, right? So they are telling you what happened to them. There's police reports that back up what has happened and how it has happened. So from my perspective, I I would say if you have not read it yet, you should absolutely read it. You should do yourself the favor of doing it, and also I think the victims deserve to have people read what happened to them because it is absolutely scandalous. But what makes it, I think, even worse is that I expect this from Muslim men. And to make this very, very quick, anyone who sits here going, "Oh, it's not all Muslims," you, the people who are interpreting the Quran absolutely correctly are the extremists doing this. Nothing that happened in this report, not a single word of what these girls said happened to them, is stuff that the Quran does not give Muslims the right to do. 100%. A Muslim can have an X amount of wives. I think it's 4 wives. And then Muhammad tells them, whatever your right hand possesses, right? So you can have as many slave or sex slaves as you can possibly conquer, because that's literally what it means. What your right hand possesses, that's what you gain through conquest. And you can do with those slaves literally whatever you want. There is no limitation on how you can treat these slaves, what you can do to them, what you can demand from them. It is quite legitimately just open ended. So I don't want to hear anything from people saying, "Oh, moderate Islam," and we'll talk a little bit about the moderate Islam and if it even exists. But for now, the thing that I think is the biggest disgrace in this entire report is when you go down. There's a page where they actually go into. Oh, there's a part where they actually go into some of the failings of the services that is meant to save people, right? Services that are meant to keep people. It's this portion here. The demographic and cultural drivers are clear. So, in this portion of the executive summary of the report, they actually go into detail on how schools where kids go to school, were aware of grown men who are not the parents of young girls picking these young girls up from school, reports of rapes happening on the school premises, girls showing up with bruises and all sorts of scars, clearly being drugged and drunk. And what did those schools do? They expelled the kids. Those kids were removed from the school. Not, it wasn't reported to the police. It wasn't reported to social services. Let's talk about the police. Crime reports from the police were never even filed. And if they were filed, the police would oftentimes go after the victims of these crimes, not the perpetrators. The police would let known rapists out onto the street on bail whilst their victim is the one being vilified. And here's the big thing. If a young girl wanted to speak out, the Muslim rape gangs will tell her in no uncertain terms, if you speak out, if you tell anyone about what we're doing, we will kill you and your family. It's as simple as that. And so what happened was a lot of these girls just suffered in silence because what else can they do? They don't want to see their families murdered, and the police just doesn't seem to care. Social services, actually even worse. Now, to keep in mind, social services is the service that the government runs, particularly because the government needs to take care of vulnerable children. That's the point of social services. Instead, what often happened was, and there's actual reports here, where the social services would get a girl who was raped, who was abused, who was harassed, who was beaten half to death. They would take that girl to the hospitals, right? The hospitals would record all of these sexual injuries that these girls sustained, and then social services would release the girl back to the migrant that had perpetrated all of this on her. Social services would just give the girl back to the migrant. Or social services would place girls, fresh girls, into group homes where these Muslims had already set up a massive network of people, right? To basically get these girls out and move them into grooming gang houses where they could effectively have their way. And you have girls literally accounting events where they would be drugged against their will, and then dozens of men would take their turn on them. You have girls as young as 11 years old, being raped by over 100 men. Now, that to me, if that doesn't get your blood boiling, you're not human. If that doesn't signal that there is a sickness within your society, and I don't mean the Muslims, I mean the government. I mean the people who work in your police forces. I mean the people who work in your social services. I mean the very people who are meant to serve you is sick. Then I don't know if you're actually human. I don't think you know what empathy is. I don't think you know what it means to be a good person. If you are a good person and you read through this report, not even all of it, if you just get to the first few victims' testimonies, because the report doesn't try to, do the nice ones first and then end on a bang. No, it goes from the beginning. It just goes after the victims and tells you exactly victim after victim after victim what happened to them. They don't go after the victims. They don't attack the victims, but the victims tell in detail everything that actually happened to them. Now, here's a question. And this is a question that I think the entirety of the West is going to be confronted with in the near term. this is going to happen. We have heard it said, and this was Winston Churchill who officially said it, at least that's been attributed to him. Democracy isn't perfect, but it's the best system we have. Right? That's the line that everyone sort of hears. Democracy isn't perfect, but it's the best we have. And so we have to operate within the confines of democracy. Now, on the surface, this appears to be generally a good practice, right? If you go prior to the invention of democracy, the way it would usually work is at the death of a king, there would always be civil war. The civil wars may sometimes have been very localized because you have a bunch of royal family members that are fighting over the throne. Oftentimes, it could be the entire nation that is drawn into the civil war. Or you would have other kingdoms spotting weakness and then they decide to invade during this spat between the royal families. Whatever the case might be, it was always violent, right? You didn't really ever have one king lead into another, and it was just a peaceful transition of power. That was actually super rare. And so democracy comes around, and for the first time in history, and it was actually in America, where for the first time ever, you have a president voted out of office and he surrenders his power freely. No fight, no war, no nothing. He just surrenders it. That is one of the things that makes America this incredibly special country because it is the first country in history where power is relinquished without debate. The president lost the vote and he gives the power to the next guy who now won the vote. Um, so this is a big moment in history. And it works really well because from there, almost every other country starts to follow suit. Everyone becomes democratic. And we have this peaceful transition of power that happens over and over and over and over and over again. Here's my question. What happens when the system itself, and by that I don't mean the politicians who are merely the faces of the system, I mean when the entire police department, the entire military, the entire social services department, the entire government structure has become so corrupt that it doesn't matter who you vote into office. The person that occupies number 10 in Britain or the union buildings in South Africa, that person doesn't matter because the system itself is corrupt to the core. And so it doesn't matter if you have a new president, that new president will not be able to change the levels of corruption. You look at America. America is a country that is set up on the idea of limiting the extent of corruption as much as possible. And Donald Trump, or President Trump rather, have spent the last 2 years trying to undo the corruption in the American system. And you're seeing it, right? The amount of states that is overrun by illegal immigrants, the amount of states that are trampling on their citizens' rights and their citizens' freedoms, the amount of democratic states that are so embroiled in corruption that it will take years to actually uncover all of the corruption that happens inside Washington, D.C. Now, luckily, President Trump has the Supreme Court, he has the House, and he has the Senate. But the House and the Senate is so corrupt that even the Republicans that are in there that is trying to fix the problem is outnumbered by the Democrats and the Republicans that are part of the problem. So then the question becomes, then the question becomes, how do we fix that system? How do you fix it when the system itself has become the problem? Because remember, in a democracy, you only really get to vote for the people in charge of the system. You don't get to vote for the system. The system itself is set up by the politicians and it's run by a bunch of bureaucrats that will never be elected, nor will anyone ever know their names. How do you fix that? And to my mind, there really is only one way, and that is revolution. When the French started to realize that their queen, Marie Antoinette, was corrupt to the core and that she was to blame for most of their sufferings, they beheaded her. because the people had had enough. And that story is sort of not unique to France. Many kings and queens throughout history have been beheaded by their people due to corruption. Because when the system becomes corrupt, there's only one way to really fix it, and that is violently. That's the only real avenue that the people have at their disposal. And I believe that we are at the precipice of this in the UK. I say we. I'm not from the UK, but I say we because I don't believe that this is a problem that only exists in the UK. And I think a lot of people mistakenly see this report and think to themselves, well, that's in the UK. We don't have these issues. Now, let's just focus on South Africa for a second. Um, if you think that South Africa doesn't have these issues, my next question to you would be: do you believe that the UK was just unlucky in the types of migrants that they got? Do you believe that it was just bad luck? They got the worst of a bad bunch, and they're gonna have to fix it. South Africa itself has between 70 and 100,000 Pakistani men. Now, the report itself highlights that one of the key problems. Let me read this for you, just so that you understand. The demographic and cultural drivers are clear. Perpetrators from Pakistani Muslim and other Muslim backgrounds operated under an honor and shame based clan code that treated non Muslim girls, especially white working class girls, as property available for sexual use. Now, what they mean by this is there's a clan system that exists in Pakistan. If you are part of the Pakistani community in any country in the world, and you know that there are Pakistani men who are going about doing things that they're not supposed to do, and you speak out, the Pakistani men of the community will kill your family, or they'll beat you, or they'll make sure that you get your comeuppance, because it's a clan honor based system. You're not supposed to bring dishonor. One of the victims actually remarks when she tried to escape from the house of hell that she was kept in, the men beat her and then continued to rape her. And their justification was, if she had escaped, if she had successfully escaped, she would have brought dishonor upon them. And so she was being raped and beaten for her own good, to learn not to bring dishonor upon her Muslim captors. Right? And so now you think to yourself, and by the way, welcome to everyone else that have joined, just getting sort of warmed up here. So if I'm not responding to you directly, please know that whenever I look this way, I am looking at chat. So I do see what you guys are saying, but I don't want to interrupt myself too much. So let's quickly talk about this idea of moderate Islam and whether or not there is such a thing, whether or not you could make the argument that moderate Islam exists. So first and foremost, I think a lot of people misunderstand the history of Islam, and very specifically, most people know nothing about the Quran. So you have to understand this in the fullness of the faith itself, because Islam is not just a faith. That's the first mistake that people make. People like to look at Christianity, and oftentimes this is sort of, I don't know if this was done on purpose to sort of purposefully blind or blur the lines, but you'll get people who use the phrase Abrahamic religions or Abrahamic religions, right? To say that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and you'll hear this often from leftists saying they worship the same God. Now, I want to make one thing very clear. Christians, Muslims, and Jews do not worship the same God. Christians and Jews do not worship the same God. Because if you are a Christian, you believe that God is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It is the triune God. 3 persons, 1 Godhead. That's God. If you remove Christ, you don't have God. If you remove the Holy Spirit, you don't have God. If you don't believe in all 3 equally, You don't believe in the Christian Bible. It's as simple as that. You don't believe in the Christian God. The Jews reject Christ and they reject the Holy Spirit. They don't believe in the Holy Spirit. And so, from that perspective, the Jews don't serve the God of the Christians. And you can't make the argument that they do. Christianity flows out of Judaism, that's true. But if you read Paul's letters to the Romans, Paul's letters to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, and Paul's letter to the Galatians, Paul makes it very clear the Jews completely missed what the Bible said. Paul says the Jews became workers of the law rather than workers of grace. And what he means by that is the Jews stopped believing in God and the power of God and instead placed the law above all else. The law became everything. You just have to do all of these things and then you'll be saved. Paul even makes the mention there, and he says, Abraham believes in God, and that is counted to him as righteousness, and that's before he was circumcised. Now, circumcision, in the belief of Paul and them, circumcision is the sign of the law. If you become a Jew, you get circumcised, now you are in the law. But Abraham is counted as righteous before he ever gets circumcised. So Paul makes the argument, what God always wanted was belief, relationship with his people. The Jews completely forgot the God relationship part and just started doing what the law told them. So Jews and Christians do not serve the same God. Moreover, you cannot even begin to make the argument that Muslims and Jews and Christians serve the same God, because Islam itself is a complete false religion based on its own facts. Now, have any of you here in chat ever heard of the words the Islamic dilemma? Have you guys heard of that? Do any of you want me to quickly explain what the Islamic dilemma is? Let me ask that instead, because I'm sure some of you have heard of the Islamic dilemma, but I just want to know if I'm supposed to explain it. Does everyone understand it? Actually haven't. Do tell. Optimal Toast, how you doing, bro? Yes, please. I also don't believe there is such a thing as a moderate Muslim. Neil, agreed. Okay, so the Islamic dilemma is the one thing that Muslim scholars will not debate. And the reason they can't debate it is because no matter what they say, it destroys Islam. So in the Quran, specifically during the Meccan verses of the Quran, this is the first few years of Muhammad's life, Muhammad preaches that the people of the book, so those would be the Jews and the Christians, received the word of God, right? Muhammad confirms this in the Quran. Now, I know Muslims will tell you, but Muhammad didn't write the Quran. Yes, he did, right? Or at least someone close to him wrote it. There's, if, and I will go so far as saying this, if Allah wrote the Quran, Allah is a moron, because he got almost everything wrong, from the way that he created the universe, because it doesn't make sense how he created most of the universe, to how people are born, where sperm is made. Allah apparently thinks that sperm is made in the ribs of man. We know that that's not true. So if Allah wrote the Quran has some serious issues with just basic scientific fact. Okay, so that needs to be understood. But moreover, right, the people, the Muslims, believe that the Quran is the word of Allah. It is pure, it is perfect, and it states that the word of Allah, so whatever Allah writes, cannot be corrupted. Never. No man. If a man tried to corrupt the word of God, that man would be killed. It will not happen. Muhammad confirms that both the Old Testament and the New Testament is the word of God. Allah, according to Muhammad, gave his word to the Jews as well as to the Christians, and now in Muhammad, Allah gives his final word. So both the Torah and the Bible and the Quran are all three the word of God. Here's the Islamic dilemma. If the Bible and the Torah is true, then the Quran is false, because the Quran contradicts multiple passages in both, in the New Testament as well as in the Old. For starters, the Quran says that Jesus wasn't crucified. The Quran says that Allah took someone and made him look like Jesus, but Jesus escaped. So Jesus wasn't crucified. Moreover, the Quran says that Jesus wasn't the Son of God, because God can't have any sons. It's impossible, right? According to Muslims and according to Muhammad, God cannot have sons. And so Jesus is not the Son of God, he's just a prophet. Well, that clearly conflicts with the Bible. So if the Quran confirms the Bible, then the Bible contradicts the Quran, meaning the Quran is false. But if the Quran is true, then it means that both the Bible and the Torah have been corrupted, and then the Quran is false because the Quran says that the word of God cannot be corrupted. So that's the Islamic dilemma. No matter what it is, if the Bible and the Torah is corrupt, then the Quran is wrong because the Quran says that the word of God cannot be corrupted. But if the Quran, if the Bible and the Torah isn't corrupt, then the Quran is wrong because the Bible and the Torah conflict with the Quran on almost everything. So that's the Muslim dilemma right there, sort of to start off with. It's something that Muslims will always run into. Next, you have to understand, and remember, the topic here is moderate Islam. Is there such a thing? Can moderate Islam even exist? Now, I've skipped over a lot of things with the Islamic dilemma. You can listen to people like Dr. David Wood or people like God Logic on YouTube, Sam Shimon. There's multiple sort of Christian apologetic apologists that will tell you in a lot more detail all of the passages that disprove the Quran and the Quranic dilemma and or the Islamic dilemma and all the rest of it. I'm just giving you guys a broad overview because I myself am not a Muslim scholar. What I know, I literally just search for dependent on the topic. So I have not, I won't say that I've studied the Quran in detail to the point where I can actually really make much of a case outside of basics. Okay. So moderate Islam requires a couple of things in order for it to ultimately play out. Well, before I forget what I was originally talking about. So the mistake that people make is thinking that for Islam, Judaism, and Christianity is somehow the same. That it somehow operates the same. So when people look at how Christians operate generally, which is kind, helping, serving, Christians are not in the modern era going out just waging war and conquering people and raping and pillaging and all the rest of it. This is not something that Christians do. So they think that because Christians don't do it, that should be true for all of the Abrahamic religions, right? Because they all come from the same God, they all believe the same things, so they're all the same. As I showed, that's just not true. Next up, you have to understand the blinding spots within Western society about Islam. So there is a term in Islam. I can't remember the exact term at the moment, but there is a term. I could probably Google it. You guys can Google it as well. But Muslims are allowed to lie to non-believers, to non-Muslims, if it is in service of Allah. So when a Muslim tells you anything, you need to take that with a grain of salt because they are allowed to lie. Taqiyya, I think that's the phrase. Thank you, determining. Taqiyya, which is literally they're allowed to lie. Moreover, the Quran is a very interesting book because the Quran effectively is divided into three different passages or phases. And these phases can be very well mapped onto Muhammad's life. This is why we know that Muhammad most likely wrote it, or someone at least close to Muhammad wrote this book, because the first third of the Quran is known as the Meccan verses. These are the peaceful, beautiful verses that every single Muslim will quote from when they tell you that Islam is a religion of peace. They will not quote the Medina verses, and they will most certainly not quote the warrior verses or the warlord verses. Those they will not quote to you. They will quote the Meccan verses. Needs to be understood. At the time of Muhammad's Meccan expedition, Muhammad is sort of one man in the city with multiple religions. And the Meccans have a rule. They allow all religions to operate within Mecca, provided that you do not force anyone to convert to your religion, right? And you don't criticize any of the religions. So all of the religions are welcome in Mecca. You can't criticize other religions. You can't attack people for their religion. You can't forcibly convert people. So Muhammad has this, and scholars have actually highlighted this. Muhammad sort of takes a lot of the belief from a lot of others, because Muhammad tells the Meccan people that his new faith, the God that spoke to him, is the God of all gods. And so all religions are effectively his religion. You know, if you're part of the is it Zoroastrian? Can't remember the exact word now, but it's still a mystical faith that sort of runs through the Middle East. Zoroastrian. Yeah. It's something. I can't. The pronunciation is weird. But if you're part of the Zora, let's just say Zora faith, right? You are welcome in Islam, because effectively Allah is still all of that, right? All of that is still the same. Zoroastrian, that's the one. Zoroastrian. Thank you. The Zoroastrian faith, you're part of Islam. If you're a Christian, you're part of Islam. If you're this, you're part of Islam. There were even some Buddhists hanging out in Medina, in Mecca, and they are also part of Islam, right? Because all is welcome. It's one big tent, and everyone can live in it. So the Meccan verses is really tame. Muhammad doesn't preach about killing people. He doesn't preach about all of this nonsense. He just sort of exists, you know. Muhammad is very unsuccessful in Mecca. He converts about 70 people. And then his 70 followers start to become a bit rowdy. They start to become aggressive. And the Meccan authorities go, leave. Get out. You've done enough. So Muhammad and his 70 followers have to leave Mecca because, the peaceful Islam did not work that well. And Muhammad arrives in Medina. Now, this is where things get interesting, because this is the second third of the Quran, the Medina verses. Now, in Medina, there are 3 Jewish tribes that live in Medina. Medina is a Jewish city. Basically, just Jews who live there. There's these 3 main tribes that control everything. These 3 tribes are at war with one another. They don't like each other. They're constantly fighting. They're constantly arguing. This one is stealing this. This one is doing this. This one is... And Muhammad, being quite skilled in diplomacy, manages to wriggle his way into almost mediator. Muhammad suggests to them that because he's not Jewish, but remember, his faith is for the Jews, it's for everyone, right? So he serves the same God as them, and he tells them all of these stories about how, their God is his God, and his God has just given him new revelation. Now, the Jews don't really believe that, he's got the new revelation, but they do accept that he's a Jew, maybe, but just a different kind of Jew, right? They believe slightly different things. But Muhammad basically tells them, hey, because I'm not part of your 3 tribes, maybe I can be the mediator between you 3, so I can sort of be the government. And if you guys have disputes, me and my people will solve these disputes for you so that you don't have to, continuously fight and kill each other. And so they sort of accept this, and they go, okay, no worries, we'll do this, right? So Muhammad becomes a de facto political leader in Medina. Muhammad then, sort of goes along kind of conquering and subverting a lot of the villages around Medina. But for a time, this is actually where the famous verse in the Quran comes from, where the Jews come to Muhammad and they ask Muhammad to settle a dispute between them. This is in Medina. And Muhammad, sitting on the judgment pillow, as they called it, actually gets up from the judgment pillow and he asks them to bring him the book. And he calls them people of the book. You have received the word of God. Why do you need me to now judge you when you have the judgment of God? And he puts the Torah on the cushion. And he says, there you go, right? This is your judge. Go for it, right? So Muhammad confirms the Torah as it is written, the Old Testament effectively. That's your thing, right? You judge yourselves because you have the word of God here. 5 years. 5 years later, there is not a single Jew left in Medina. 5 years after Muhammad arrives. Now, some of you might say, wow, he converted all of them to Islam. No, he killed most of them. Because as Muhammad went, he started with the weakest of the Jew tribes, and he slaughtered them and chased those who remained out. Then he went after the second, and finally, when he went after the third, he was already so powerful that there was no hope in hell that they could stand. It is once Muhammad successfully conquers Medina that Muhammad now understands how conquest is supposed to happen. And Muhammad starts his reign of terror over the Middle East. And in the subsequent years of his life, he would effectively conquer most of the Middle East. And after his death, those who followed him would conquer the rest. This is the 3 stages of Islam. And it's important that you understand this because that is the religion that people on the left will tell you is moderate. It's a moderate religion. It's a peaceful religion. And then you have to sort of ask yourself, okay, what part of the religion are you talking about? See, because technically the Muslims aren't lying to you. Islam is a very peaceful religion if everyone is Muslim and if everyone follows every single rule that Allah has. There's many of them, by the way. But if you follow those rules, Islam will not bother you at all. In fact, most people who go to Muslim countries will remark how incredibly safe it is. You can walk in the middle of the night and nothing will happen to you, provided that you wear, if you're a woman, a black bag that effectively covers your entire body. And if you're a man, you don't have a mustache that on your upper lip, and you pray 5 times a day. But if you do all of those things, life's actually fairly safe and peaceful in these Muslim countries. That's because the faith part of Islam is in the Meccan verses, where it's peaceful, loving, everyone's nice to each other. The Medina verses is the political arm of Islam that is not peaceful. And then the warrior arm of Islam is even less peaceful than the Medina or the political arm of Islam. So now I ask you, when people say moderate Islam, there needs to be something that you can moderate on. And now there might be some leftists here who say, well, Christianity also has a lot of bad stuff that happens in the Old Testament. And so we'll do just a very quick overview of the Old Testament. There is a lot of violence in the Old Testament. I'll admit this. There's also a lot of violence in the New Testament, but that violence most leftists don't care about because it's mostly Christians being killed by other non-believers. So obviously for the left, I imagine that's the highlight of the New Testament for them. Whenever they read of Stephen being stoned, or when they read of Paul being beheaded and stoned, or Peter being crucified upside down, these are probably like highlights for people on the left. But the Old Testament is full of violence. So how do Christians get around this? Why aren't Christians going around slaughtering literally everyone in their path? What exactly is the difference between Christianity and Islam? Well, in the Old Testament, all violence is a direct judgment of God on a very specific people in a very specific time period. There is not a single judgment in the Old Testament that God gives that is open-ended. In other words, God never tells the Israelites, wage war against the Amalekites for all eternity. God never tells the Jews, wage war against the non believers for all eternity. That's just not what happens. When God sends the Israelites to war, it is always in judgment on a specific people for a specific purpose. So let's take the most egregious of these. We've discussed this a few weeks ago. The Amalekites, the hill tribes of Canaan. So the hill tribes of Canaan are warned by God for 400 years, prophet after prophet after prophet, to stop sacrificing their children to Moloch. The hill tribes do not listen. After 400 years, God sends a prophet again, and God says, I will now exact my judgment upon you. And God's judgment, his ruling, is that every single Amalekite of the hill tribes must die. Every single one. Man, woman, child. Doesn't matter. They all get killed now. That's God's judgment. We know that that doesn't include all Amalekites for all eternity. It's a specific judgment on a specific people for a specific crime that they are judged. And they are warned for 400 years to stop doing it before it happens. The Quran isn't that. Muslims are told that they must wage war against the unbeliever into perpetuity. They are not told to wage war against a specific group of unbelievers or against a specific group of Christians or specific group of Jews. You are at war with all Jews and all Christians and all non-believers into perpetuity. Now, the way a lot of Muslims get around that and don't do what the extremists do is they simply ignore those verses. The problem with that is that that is a complete wrong read of the Quran, because Quranic scholars have always maintained that the later verses of the Quran supersedes or takes priority over the earlier verses. So in the same way that in Christianity, the New Testament takes priority over the Old Testament. Christ comes and Christ fulfills the law so that we are no longer under the law. So while Christians will read Deuteronomy and Numbers, we are not subject to that law. So the later verses, the new covenant of God, is greater than the old, right? By human language. It's not actually greater, but it takes precedent over the old verses. Quran does the same. The earlier versions, the Mecca verses, the nice ones, they don't count if they conflict with the later verses. And you'll be surprised, or maybe you won't be surprised to learn that every single one of the earlier love, peace, kindness, and fellow man in the earliest Meccan verses of the Quran are all contradicted by the older versions. Because Muhammad in Mecca believes, and he tells his followers, when we get to the Jews, they will confirm that I am a prophet in their Bible. Their Torah will tell them that I am coming. You'll see. So when they get to Medina and they talk to the Jews laugh at him. Like, where in our Bible does it tell of your coming? It's not here. So they reject him as a prophet. The same is true. He tells these followers, the Christians will confirm me. You'll hear when we get to Christians, they'll tell you, yes, Muhammad, you're a prophet. Our Bible tells us that you are coming. Except there's only really one verse that you could possibly make out where the Bible tells us of Muhammad's coming. And that is when Paul tells the Corinthians, if I or even an angel preaches to you any other gospel than the one that you have been taught, let them be accursed. Now, you can make the argument that that verse maybe speaks about Muhammad, but I think all of us will agree that's not the nicest way to speak about Muhammad. So when Muhammad gets rejected by the Jews and gets rejected by the Christians, suddenly The Quran or Allah changes his mind like this, and Allah's like, no, 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 never mind all this peaceful nonsense, kill them all, right? You will subjugate and kill all of them. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of people will point out, but hold on, Stefan, not all Christians are killed in Muslim countries. Some of them pay like a super tax that keeps them safe, right? Or it's called the submission tax, which is what's been invented in Muslim countries. This was not in the Quran. In fact, this jizya or the super tax, thank you, the determining, that's not in the Quran. That's added later. That's from the hadiths. That's Muslim scholars and Muslim leaders who ultimately realized that they can make a lot of money out of these Christians. Because effectively, if you're a Christian or a Jew, if the Muslims conquered your land, you were given an option: convert or die. Convert or die. And so you do eventually get slightly more moderate Muslims that go, well, maybe won't convert or die. Maybe you can just pay a tax. And then eventually that'll get abused as well. And also, you should understand jizya is not a permanent thing. The Muslims will eventually kill the Christians that pay jizya. It's a temporary thing. So eventually they get a bit extreme and they just start killing Christians anyways, because they have to appease Allah, because technically Allah doesn't actually allow them to charge this special tax to Christians or Jews. Everyone else, if you're not a Christian or a Jew, Islam will not. Now, my reason for giving you all of this background is, how do you moderate a religion like this? When you look at Christianity, it's actually quite easy to make moderate or to moderate. And the reason it's so easy is Jesus' final command to his people is love one another just as I have loved you. That's Jesus' final command. Jesus doesn't send them out into the world to go slaughter and kill and force conversions. Love one another as I have loved you. That's his final command. And many of you might say, and I realize I'm sort of arguing against myself here, but I'm trying to remember, um, I'm trying to think of all the ways in which people might disagree. Um, so a lot of people might say, yes, but Stefan, look at the history of Christianity. Right? Look at all the things that Christians did, all the wars that Christians fought. Are you telling me that Christianity is this peaceful religion? And to that, I would say, never underestimate the time it takes for people to adapt. I'm going to give you guys a great example of how God operates, because many people don't necessarily know their Bibles well enough. And so you get Christians that even struggle with some of the verses in the Old Testament. And I have a lot of sympathy for that, because I myself was once such a Christian that really struggled with some of the verses in the Old Testament. Because on first reading, the New Testament doesn't say that you can't have slaves, right? It gives conditions for how you should treat your slaves, and it certainly ends chattel slavery. So you're not allowed to go take people from another land against their will and bring them as slaves to your land. So slave trade is illegal under the Old Testament law, but God certainly allows for slavery, right? So there are some verses that's quite weird. But I would argue that that's because most people don't know who God is. Jesus tells us who God is in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, God is meek. What is meekness? It's to be strong and yet to act kind. Meekness in our modern world, we sort of hear meek and we think weak, but meek is not weak. That's literally the opposite of weak. Meek is to have the ability to destroy everyone or to defeat your enemy, and yet to be kind towards them. God is meek. Jesus says, be meek. When Jesus says be meek, what Jesus is effectively trying to tell Christians, be like God. Be the way that God is. On the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. And Jesus is talking about all these attributes that he's revealing about who God is. So to give you an example of this, When is the first sacrifice made in the Bible? The first animal sacrifice. When is that made in the Bible? So, Halbin on destroying everything good. Uh, Miguel, we'll get to it. No human flaws will ever make Christ's message false, and no amount of virtue and good doing will ever make the Quran true. Also true, Saint. Very, very true. Never mistake peacefulness for weakness. Once the empathy and sympathy is done, forgiveness is no longer an option. Siege, how you doing, sir? What's the jizya rate? 50, 80? Ravi, it depends on the specific kingdom and their interpretation. Because remember, it's not in the Quran. It's effectively they decide it, right? Yeah. So the first sacrifices in the Bible is Cain and Abel, right? Cain brings his vegetables. So by the way, the Bible warns us against veganism right in Genesis, because Cain is a vegetable farmer, Abel is a sheep herder. He has meat, and the vegans kill the carnivores. That's a joke, by the way. I'm not saying that you're not allowed to be a vegan. You can do whatever you want. You are free to eat as you will, but that is just funny, right? But okay, so Cain and Abel does the first sacrifices to God. When is the law given to the Jews, to the Israelites? Not until 2,500 years later. So why did Cain and Abel sacrifice to God? Because the sacrifices would only be installed 2,500 years later. That's when God would tell them to follow the law and then to sacrifice so that their sins may be forgiven them. Why did they do that? Well, think about how humans operate. And husbands, you will know this, when your wife is upset with you, you've done something wrong, you've said something wrong, you instinctively know to buy her something, to bring her something along with your sorry, whether that be a chocolate or flowers or whatever it is. And I'm reminded of this because the other day I'm standing in Spa and I see this guy standing in front of the flower rack, and he chose this, not roses, but it's nice flowers. He chose this bouquet of flowers, and my first thought was, I think he's in the doghouse, and he needs to go apologize, because why else would he be buying flowers here? Why do we do this? As a child, I remember whenever my dad would spank us, one of the ways in which we would say sorry is we would make them coffee or tea. They never asked us to do that, right? But as humans, we instinctively understand that to truly say sorry requires some kind of gift, some kind of offering, that we need to bring to make sure that our apology is sincere, to show the other person that this is a sincere apology. I'm not just saying I'm sorry. I'm making a gesture to show you how sorry I actually am. So we understand this instinctively. We do it all the time. You do it with your friends. You do it with your loved ones. Wives will often do this with their husbands as well. When she's made a mistake, she'll become all cute and cuddly and playful because she understands, in order to show her sorrow, her repentance for what she has done, if I can borrow that word, there has to be some kind of sacrifice that comes alongside that. So God allows that. There's nowhere in the Bible where it tells us that God instructed Cain and Abel to sacrifice to him. They just do it. The law only comes 2,500 years later through Moses, and this is where God uses their cultural practice, because they sacrifice. That's what they do. They understand, I've made a mistake. I need to give you something so that you will forgive me. And so God uses that cultural practice and continues it. But as Paul remarks, as Peter remarks, The sacrifice itself means nothing to God. An animal, and by the way, it's not just Paul and Peter who remarks on this. The prophet Isaiah says this. What good is a lamb or a cow to you, Lord? So the prophets understood God doesn't care about the sacrifice. The sacrifice is for us so that we feel that our sorrow and our sorry is worthy of something. But the sacrifice for God means nothing. What God wants from his people is belief. So, in other words, if you say you are sorry, believe that I will forgive you and I will forgive you. That's what God wants. The sacrifice, that's for us. That's so that we feel that we've truly said sorry. But God wanted belief. He wanted relationship, to know that his people should know that he loves them so much that if they say sorry, he will forgive them. So God uses cultural practices and changes it slowly into what I might call perfection. So slavery, yes, that's in the Bible. That's a hard part of the Bible, right? But it already changes the cultural nature of slavery. The Jews have a slavery that in their day and age was leaps and bounds more humane than anything the surrounding tribes ever had. Because in the surrounding tribes, a slave was worse than dung. They could do with that slave whatever they wanted. They could kill that slave. They could amputate and mutilate that slave. They could do whatever they want because the slave is your property. The Jews were not allowed to do this. A slave was to be cared for and treated well and given rest. You can't work your slave to death. This is all stuff that the Bible brings in, God through his law brings in, that wasn't there. So in that same vein, you might make the argument that, but hold on, Stefan, the Christian nations had slaves for more than 2,000 years, right? Um, before it was finally abolished. Well, not more than, it's about 1,800 years. Except the first Christian scholars that starts to debate about the relevance and the acceptance of slavery dates back to the 2nd century. So not even 100 years after the death of Christ do Christian scholars start to look at the Bible and say, I don't think we can have slaves. Now, yes, that will take a lot of time, right? And it sort of permeates, and you see throughout the ages, kingdom after kingdom, you have these Christian scholars that write about the things that the kings are doing and asks the question, is this stuff that we as Christians are allowed to do? And time again, they arrive at the answer, no, we should not be doing this. This is not what the Bible preaches. And ultimately, it leads to Christians abolishing slavery. So yes, it took time. And God operates within our own cultures, and he changes it slowly because he is meek. Because to change it abruptly would destroy cultures, it would destroy kingdoms. So he changes it slowly, in the same way that a Christian coming to faith doesn't like this just become this sanctified being. It takes time. It's slow. You will fall. You will make mistakes. You'll go back to your same sins. It will be a back and forth. But just like investments, over time, you will be more and more sanctified. This is the mark of a religion that can be moderated, because very often the bad things that that religion embarked upon were not things that the Bible said they were allowed to do. It was things that humans wanted to do and then found a verse that made it possible for them to do. But then Christians would look at the verse in context and say, I don't think this is what that verse says. I don't think you can just do this, right? And eventually it would change to the point where the Christian faith is incredibly moderate in terms of how it is applied, even in its most absolute way, right? You go look at the Puritans. And another mistake that I just need to point out here is that there is no such thing as Puritans burning witches. I just need to make that super clear. The actual Puritans, the people who were the Puritans, they never burnt a single witch. There were people who used Puritanism as a guise to burn witches, but not a single one of the people that ever burnt a witch wrote any books that people today read about the Puritans. So just to make that clear, right? So anyone who thinks, oh, but Christians burnt witches, yeah, bad people burnt witches, but the Puritans were actually very much against it. And there's actual Puritans who wrote about the witch trials and said this is not how God would do it. So just to make that a little bit more clear, because there might be people who still believe that the Puritans somehow were involved in it. But ultimately, Christianity has the elements required for moderation. Islam does not. Because in order to moderate Islam, you would need to lose 2/3 of the Quran. You would need to throw away the latter 2/3 of the Quran and only keep the Meccan verses. And if people say, well, most Muslims don't go around killing people, that's not the question. The question that you should be asking is when the extremists finally declare Sharia law, do you imagine the Muslims will accept Sharia law? Or do you think they'll fight with you against Sharia law? Those moderate Muslims that you work with, that you see every single day, they don't hurt a fly. If Sharia law was to be established, do you imagine that those Muslims would fight with you to stop Sharia law? Remember, Sharia law is the mandated law of the Quran of Allah. So a Muslim would be required to go directly against Allah if they were to fight for you or with you to stop Sharia law. Therefore, I conclude there is no such thing as moderate Islam. There are certain Jews who do not engage in the most violent verses of the Quran. That is true. But the most violent verses of the Quran is not the extent or the maximum extent of the evils of Islam. There are many things that Islam does in the lead up to it that is just as bad, if not worse. For example, when you have Islam raping over 2,500 British girls, 2,500 British girls. Benjamin, no, 250,000. Sorry, not 2,500. 250,000. 2,500 is the years between Cain and Abel and Moses. 250,000 British girls were raped, beaten, and abused by Muslim immigrants. And I will tell you this for now, to use a British phrase. This problem exists everywhere. You drive in Cape Town and you drive through these colored neighborhoods filled with mosques, just mosque after mosque after mosque popping up. And you think to yourself, how many girls in these neighborhoods are being raped, beaten, and abused every single day, knowing full well they can't go to the police? Because the police in South Africa, even if they were not corrupt, is completely inept. How many girls in our neighborhoods are consistently being abused by Muslim immigrants because they can? Because if you are not a Muslim, you are free property to do with as you please. And some of the victims actually say that's what they were told while they were being abused. You're not a Muslim, which makes you a dirty, filthy pig dog, meaning they can do with you whatever they want. In fact, Muhammad went so far as to say that if a man has sex with a non-believer, in other words, rapes a non-believer, that's not adultery. So a man can be married and rape as many non believers as he wants. That's not adultery because non believers are viewed as less than human. They're dirty, filthy animals. So they can do whatever they want with them. The issue, of course, is that this is a failure of government. This is a failure of the people that we have elected to keep us safe. And it is actually coming to South Africa, those of you that might not be sure. We discussed this last year, um, December. I made a video on this. But Al Jama'ah, the political party for Muslims, um, they suggested a new, or they tabled a new bill called the Crime of Apartheid Bill. Now, the bill itself, we have not seen yet. They have not introduced or released the full list of the bill, but the bill itself has the backing of the ANC, the MK, the EFF, and everyone. And effectively, it seeks to criminalize anyone engaged in either the crime of apartheid. So that would include people who back Israel, people who aren't critical of Israel, people who are critical of Muslim countries or Muslim people, or just people engaged in what they call PR stunts. So if you just tweet something negative about Muslim countries, or you tweet something positive about Israel, you can be viewed as a criminal under the crime of apartheid bill. And it has the backing of more than 2/3 of our parliaments. So when this bill finally does get tabled, it's going to pass because the ANC, the MK, and the bill itself seeks to supersede all other laws. That's the one part that it might fail at. Because this Imran is trying to push it through that this bill itself will supersede the Constitution. So, in other words, it doesn't even matter if you have human rights as ascribed to you by the Constitution. The bill takes precedence over all of that. This bill becomes the optimal law of the land, the crime of apartheid bill. That's being passed in South Africa now. Islam, in the official records of South Africa, has grown, it's doubled over the last decade. 10 years ago, it was estimated there's around 1.5 to 2% Muslims in South Africa. Today, that number sits at 2.5 to 4% of Muslims in South Africa. Officially, they think it's 3%, but there are some people who suggest it may actually be as close to 4%. That's a doubling in just 10 years. If the trend holds, in another 10 years, there will be almost 10% Muslims in this country. How long do you think it takes before you get Sharia courts in Sharia areas? Because in this report of the rape gang inquiry, they actually show how parts of the UK are now completely under the jurisdiction of Sharia courts, where the actual law enforcement of the UK no longer have any power. The Sharia courts make all the decisions, and the police just have to abide by it because that's the law. Now, the reason I gave all of this preamble and the reason I wanted to discuss this is first, I thought that it was necessary. I thought that these victims deserve to be talked about. These victims deserve to have their stories told. And while I'm sure that many of the victims would maintain that they don't want to spread division, although I think once you've been a victim of Islam, um, the whole idea of unity goes out the window. The truth is that I believe Europe sits at the precipice. So you just had yesterday huge news from the European Union, where the European Union finally passed a bill that would allow nation states to mass deport immigrants from their countries, which is actually groundbreaking. Because for the first time, almost in the history of the European Union, the centrist parties of Europe sided with what the media calls the far right parties of Europe. Um, and that's that's a big deal. It's a very big deal. If you mean shithole as they already are, Yuan, I wouldn't be so quick. We'll talk about America in a second, but Europe has passed that law, so mass deportations is coming. In Britain, I do believe that Rupert Lowe, and not just Rupert Lowe, but also Nigel Farage, they're probably going to be able to make massive inroads into the political landscape of the UK, which will mean mass deportations. In America, we're already seeing mass deportations happening, right? We're seeing Donald Trump going after just about everyone. And for South Africa, really bad news for those South Africans who thought, hey, we'll just wait for Donald Trump to lose the midterms and then South Africa can go back to their evil, discriminatory ways. The peace deal in Iran seems to hold, right? It appears as if there is now peace in Iran, or at least in the Middle East, which means if Donald Trump can get the fuel price down, it's already way down. But if he gets the fuel price down to below $60, Donald Trump wins the midterms. Because Donald Trump can now go to the American people and say, we won. And Americans love a winning president. So I think it's bad news for all South African leftists everywhere. Because, yeah, President Trump did deliver the victory that he promised, although there are many who's really upset. I heard about the EU passing the bill. I hope they don't pull soft. I don't trust the globalists. Some countries won't enforce it, but I think there's a lot of countries like Georgia, Meloni's, Italy. They're probably going to go hard on it. Fix your birthrights or keep crying victim. No law, no democracy, no God can save you. Does I'm curious, right? Do you imagine that that makes you macho or seem masculine when you bark demands and then mockingly try to make points that doesn't even show? Because I'll tell you this, when Europe was Christian, birthrights wasn't a problem because Christians understand that to have children is the highest honor and it is absolutely necessary for Christians to have children. So to say no God will save you seems like God did for a long time do exactly that. Plenty of stories around that shows God's saving grace. I'm sure the Boer at the Battle for Blood River really appreciated the help of God in that moment, right? So I would say be careful that your own irrational thought doesn't make you look a fool because that's all you're really achieving here. Um, There's Democratic Union. I would choose a low birth rates and perfectly healthy children over high birth rates and have lots of low IQ defectives, quantity over quality, or quality over quantity. I think we can have both, right? And I do think that that will. So one of the things that I'm really not worried about, that I know a lot of people in the world is very worried about. I'm not worried about birth rates. I know Elon Musk makes a big deal of this. I know everyone sort of goes, "Oh, the declining birth rates, the West is dead." I am not worried about birth rates in the slightest because, first, I know that God is in control, right? So I don't have to worry because God is in control. Whatever will happen because He allows it according to His sovereign will. But moreover, the decline in birth rates is because of an increase in luxury, an increase in abundancy of choice. That does not last. that will not last. You can already see the direction that the West is going. The current system is crumbling. And when that system finally crumbles, birth rates will return. I am a no. I heard someone say yesterday, South Korea will not exist at the end of the century. And I was like, yeah, yes, it will. Yes, it will. The South Korean people will reach a point where the entire society collapse and they'll rebuild. And when they rebuild, they will start having children again. That's the nature of man. To imagine that mankind is just an entire race of people is just going to sit back and go extinct. That's nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. So yeah, I'm not worried at all about birth rates. There are too many people on Earth, so birth rates is not for me a concern. So Anita, I'm also not in that camp. There's definitely not too many people on Earth. Um, because that's sort of where this whole Bill Gates and their idea of lowering birth rates come from. They believe that there's too many people on Earth. So on our current technological scale, what we can handle currently is around 12 to 13 billion people. That's what the Earth can handle right now, right? 12 to 13 billion people. We have enough food, we have enough resources, we have enough everything to handle about that. That's not to say that in the next 50 years, we're not going to come up with incredible technological advancements that make it possible for us to house double that or even three times that, right? Technology is the great equalizer in this. So, in terms of how many people we have on Earth, um, there was a study that showed this actually quite beautifully. People who think that we have too many people on Earth doesn't understand how big our Earth actually is. So, if you took every human being on the planet, so all 8 billion plus humans on this planet right now, and you put them in Texas, just the state of Texas, every single person in the world would fit in the state of Texas. They wouldn't have a lot of space, but I think it's something like 2 meters by 2 meters of space between them. Every human being on Earth fits in the state of Texas. So we have a lot of space, and we have more than enough space. We're not going to run out of space anytime soon. So I'm not too worried about that. Where was the God when 250 underage girls been subjected to this horror? Does your effective question here is the question of evil, right? Why does God allow evil to happen? And I'll be the first to acknowledge this is a tough question. It's a question that Christians far greater than I have struggled with and have consistently come up incapable of giving a satisfactory answer. Why does God allow Job to lose everything? Why does God allow Job to go through suffering, get sick, get it, lose his wife, lose his house, his car, all of his possessions? Why does God allow this? What I would say to that is be careful, O limited man, that you don't overestimate the reach of your own ability. All you have is what little you can see. Right? That's what you know. Whatever you can see and whatever your mind can possibly come up with. That's the extent of your knowledge, of your wisdom, of your everything. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You don't know what's going to happen the day after. You don't know what's happening in the world around you. You only know what other people tell you and what you're happy or lucky enough to see. Right? So you are, as a human, incredibly limited in your own knowledge. As humans, we have this feeling that God must care about our comfort. But the Bible makes it clear time and again. In fact, God says it himself. God does not put our comfort above our eternal salvation. The story of Job shows a story of God allowing great suffering on Job so as to increase the share of Job in the eternal. The story of Paul. Paul goes from prison to prison, stoning to being thrown off a wall and eventually beheaded. But through that, God brings incredible grace to Paul. In fact, I'll give you one of the greatest stories of what people like to say, why does God allow suffering? Paul is a Pharisee. So the story of Paul. Paul starts off, Paul or Saul, doesn't really matter. Saul is the Aramaic word for his name. Paul is the Greek word for his name. So it doesn't really matter, Paul or Saul. You can use either one. But Saul, because he is in Jerusalem at this time, is present at the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. As Stephen is stoned, Paul approves of the stoning, and that stoning then gives Paul an idea. Paul writes this. He goes to the Jewish council and he suggests to them that they empower him to persecute the church. And Paul goes around and he starts slaughtering Christians. In fact, Acts tells us Paul went from house to house and rounded up every single Christian he could find and put them to death under Jewish law, because Paul is a Pharisee. Now, as a result of this, the Christians scatter. All of the Christians. Okay, so to put this into perspective, on the day of Pentecost, there's around 120 Christians, right? It's the apostles as well as the disciples of Jesus. More broadly, it's 120 people. The day of Pentecost happens, and the flames from heaven, the tongues from heaven, imbue the Holy Spirit onto these 120 so that they start speaking in tongues, right? This causes all of these people who are there for Pentecost in Jerusalem, and these are people from all over the region. You have Jews, you have Greeks, you have foreigners, all sorts of people. Each of them are hearing the gospel preached in their own language. And they don't understand how this is possible because the 120 men who are standing in front of them are Jews who most likely can speak Aramaic and maybe a little Greek. But they're hearing all of these different languages, and every single one of these people are hearing the gospel in their own language. And on that day, Acts tells us that 3,000 people come to faith. As my pastor remarked last night, that's incredible church growth. You went from 120 people in your church to 3,001 in one sermon. 3,000 people come to faith. Now, Paul goes and he starts killing people in Jerusalem. The 3,000 start dispersing. They flee because they're trying to get away from Paul. One of those churches that are founded as a result of these refugees from Jerusalem rushing to get away from Paul is the church of Ephesus. These Christians from Jerusalem that are now fleeing go into Ephesus, and there they start preaching the gospel, and they find the church of Ephesus. Paul will then head to Damascus to go and persecute Christians. There he will have his Damascus moment, and Paul will eventually get sick and be cared for by the church of Ephesus. So the church that was started as a result of his persecution becomes the people that care for him and ultimately save him. The church that was founded as a result of his persecution. And he ultimately, in that church, they send him out as a missionary to go and convert the Gentiles, the church of Ephesus, the church that was started as a result of his persecution. So why does God allow suffering? It is always for his glory, so that more people might be saved. I'll give you another example of how God allows suffering, but it ultimately leads to something far greater and far better. The Muslims conquer Greece, final European bastion of Christianity. During the age, it's in the Middle Ages, Europe is suffering, and the Muslims finally conquer Greece. The Christian scholars who are in Greece flee because they know what Muslims do to Christian scholars when they conquer. They flee into Europe. The man, I can't remember his name now, but the man, the scholar from Greece that translates the Bible for the first time from Greek to Latin, becomes the friend of Martin Luther. And as a result of him translating the Bible from Greek to Latin, Martin Luther starts the Reformation. So taking something tragic and turning it into something good. Now, many of those scholars in Greece could not have known why God would allow them to be conquered by the Muslims. In fact, that man that translated the Bible and ultimately led to the Reformation, he had no idea why he suddenly had to flee for his life. But it ultimately ended into something really, really good. And coincidentally, the conquest of Greece also signals the end of the Dark Ages in Europe. Because as all of these scholars spread into Europe, Europe starts to experience the Renaissance. And it is the result of the Renaissance that the Christian word spreads throughout the entirety of Europe and beyond. So when you ask, why does God allow suffering? It's because for God, this life here, what you see as real, is a moment. And it is a rather insignificant moment for a being that is eternal. And that being wants you to spend eternity with him. And so, if suffering is what is required now to ensure salvation in the eternity, then the suffering is good. Perspectives matter, right? Perspectives matter. So, for example, is it good to tackle someone that is just unsuspectingly walking? Imagine you see a guy walking. He has his headphones in, jamming to his tunes. Can you just run up to that guy and tackle the living shit out of him? Of course not. Like, what the hell are you doing? That's very rude, right? Not to mention, it might be assault. But what if that guy was about to be hit by a bus? Could you tackle him then? Perspective matters. So what you see as this great suffering that God is visiting upon people or allowing people to go through might actually be the very thing that saves Britain. Because you don't know, and you and I cannot know. This inquiry, these rapes, may be the thing that leads to a revival in Britain, and hundreds of thousands of British people and Muslims come to faith as a result of this. And for God, their salvation is far more important than their earthly comforts. In fact, God did not even spare his own son from earthly discomfort in order to ensure eternal salvation. So I hope that answers your question, although it probably depends. Anyways, so with all of that out of the way, I do think the West is going to be dealing with a massive immigration question in the very near term. And I think that question is going to be quite heavy, right? I think it's going to be quite heavy. The determining, I never said God causes suffering. I said God allows it. Now, if you are being semantic about it, most people will tell you what's the difference, right? So I am not suggesting that God is the author of evil. God cannot do evil. evil doesn't exist within God, right? So I'm perfectly aware of that. But I do believe that God allows it, and He allows it to work for His glory. And what is His glory? Love. In fact, He says it. His glory is His steadfast, abounding in steadfast love for His people. That's God's glory, His love for us. So, yeah. Do you think things are similar or worse than the time of Babel? Um, I think it's worse, David. I think as technology increases, our ability to become corrupt increases alongside it, right? So I think with every age of strife, it builds, right? So I think every age of strife is going to be worse than the one that preceded it, um, until the final one, until the final battle, so to speak. Name I can't find. How you doing? One of my biggest reasons for having such faith is the butterfly effect. It's crazy to me how such a little change can lead to so much good. I believe it has to be planned. Name, I absolutely agree with you. I know it is planned, actually. Uh, but, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to tell you that if the rest of the world is about to have their immigration problems, South Africa will have its immigration problems first. Not for Islam, because I think our government is so painfully unaware of the evils of Islam that Islam has not even begun to register. But I will tell you this much. I will tell you this much. The ANC is panicked. Over the last 3 weeks, in fact, I will say this: I have never seen our government do so much to try and convince people not to strike. I've never seen anyone in the ANC be this passionate about a problem, be this passionate about an issue as the March and March, June 30th national shutdown. Cyril Ramaphosa has spent the last month, basically every single week, multiple times, trying to tell South Africans that it's not foreign nationals that's the problem. The real causes are inequality and slow economic growth. Of course, who is the cause of inequality and slow economic growth? The ANC stands with a Pikachu face. It is something apartheid, something or the other. Must be apartheid, right? Um, you have Julius Malema, right? He is out and about, just saying it's not the foreign nationals, it's not Africans. People should quiet down, right? In fact, Julius Malema is a bit of a snake, right? But also a bit of a coward, um, and he is a coward. I want to say this to any EFF members that may come upon this stream: your leader is a coward. Your leader has promised a revolution for more than a decade now. And your leader is so afraid that he will not start it. Instead, your leader is hoping that someone else will start it. He's begging for some Afrikaner to start the revolution, to come after him, to try and kill him. He's begging for March and March to start the revolution. Now, of course, he's hopeful. He thinks that should the revolution start, he can then sort of slip in, and become the face of the revolution, but he's too afraid to start it himself. But Julius Malema is out and about, just begging people not to go anywhere, not to attack anyone. Um, Here's Cyril Ramaphosa again. Just let us build a South Africa where every young person can realize their potential, where opportunity is not the privilege of a few, but the birthright of all. Of course, what he means to say is that they have built this system that is falling apart. But they will never admit to that. Uh, I'll just show you guys. This is something funny. Yeah. Jacob Zuma was dancing on Youth Day at the MK Youth Day celebrations and he fell down. I thought it's funny. So I'll show you guys just a little bit of a palate cleanser, before we get back into the bad stuff. Um, Here you have the DA. The DA, of course, begging for Parliament to have a joint security cluster meeting to figure out what they're going to do about xenophobia. So the DA is in on this. The EFF is in on this. Here's Cyril Ramaphosa again yesterday, just talking about. Well, here is Cyril Ramaphosa actually begging South African businesses to give the youth of South Africa a chance, right? Bring them in and give them experience. He's begging businesses to start hiring South African youth because, of course, I'll talk about why that is in a second. Here you have the ANC for the first time ever signaling that they might not be married to BE. That's a big change, no? It's a really big change. The ANC going, we're not married to BE. We might be open to a different system. I'll again explain in a second why that actually is. Here you have Fikile Mbalula, who is also telling the people of South Africa that, hey, boys, there's a lot of problems in our country. It's not all foreigners. So what is going on? What exactly is happening? The desperation of government should tell all of us that they expect June 30th to be big. The intelligence apparatus of this country, as intelligent as that apparatus may be, clearly knows something that the rest of us do not. And I want to make this clear. The ANC is the author of the violence that may or may not ensue. So I know personally of two people from Malawi, both here legally. They didn't arrive here illegally, but I was told yesterday that they are heading back to Malawi because her husband is convinced the violence is coming. They're afraid because they can see what the groups and the gangs are already doing in their townships. And so they're getting out because the groups apparently don't really care if you're here legally or illegally. If they see you, you're out, right? June 30th, and to be fair, I'm not saying that March and March are the ones that's going to be violent. In fact, that's normally not how that works. So March and March may actually have a genuine plan to just have a protest, to just show the government how upset they are. But you live in a country where more than 60% of the youth is unemployed with no hope of ever getting employed. What happens in those scenarios is frustration builds. This is why the ANC is so desperate to talk to the people of South Africa in the hopes that the people of South Africa might listen. The issue that the ANC is in, a Lamborghini, how are you doing, sir? The issue that the ANC is in, of course, no one cares. No one believes them anymore. The ANC has been the proverbial boy who cried wolf way too many times. The people of South Africa have heard all of these promises before, these promises of accountability, of economic growth, and whatnot. They have heard it before, and they no longer believe it. I'm not going to say that June the 30th might be the start of a civil war or massive protest in this country because no one can predict that. What I will say is that if June 30th is the start of it, that will also be the end of the ANC. Because If 2021 is anything to go by, the frustrations in our country has already reached peak levels. It will not take much for South Africans to finally go, well, enough. Now we're just going to fight, right? We're going to burn everything to the ground until we get what we want. And it can oftentimes start almost. So, if you actually study the start of violent protests, it can be that people who sort of attach themselves to the protest become very violent because they always wanted to be violent, right? They were more violent. So the actual protesters, the people who originally planned it, didn't want to be violent, but it was people who attached themselves to it that started the violence. But what often happens, actually most often what happens, is counter protests. So as these protesters are going around causing upset, you start to have groups that start countering. And that conflict ultimately spurs into open conflict, where it goes from a more cold, sort of just screaming at each other, to very kinetic very quickly. South Africa is already a tinderbox waiting for a spark. In 2021, we nearly, and I would say we were probably days away from a nationwide shutdown. You saw it. I mean, it shut down KwaZulu Natal entirely. You saw flares happen in Joburg. There were a couple of flares in Limpopo. Here and there, rumors and so on in the Western Cape, Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, but nothing actually kicked off. But it was there. There was an element in each of these provinces. We're now 4 years on. We have had one of the most abysmal periods of an ANC president in the history of South Africa, period, over the last 4 or 5 years. People are even more poor. The country is even worse off. Fuel prices are astronomical. Inflation is at its highest point ever. People are suffering. So, what happens next? When this kicks off, how does the ANC stop it? And I think the ANC is aware that they don't have a way to stop it. I think they're aware of that. I think if you look at how they're reacting and how desperately they're trying to talk people away from the ledge, they know they can't stop this. They're well aware that trying to stop this is a fool's errand, but they know that they have to try because once it kicks off, there's no way to bring it back. There is no military in South Africa. There is no police force in South Africa. No one is bringing this under control unless the protesters decide they don't want to go that extreme. So yeah, I'm kind of worried. I'm not going to lie to you guys. I am kind of worried about what's going to happen on uh, June the 30th. I agree. There are many groups and protesters who will start. I live in KZN. The taxi drivers came and save us. Those guys are like a paramilitary force. I think this time around, it's all going to depend on the size. You know, don't know if the taxi drivers are going to choose to go against these protesters because I think a lot of the taxi drivers are angry and frustrated. Like every communist solution, they will never run out of a group to blame. Foreigners first. Who's next? RJ, so to be entirely honest, and I think it is important that we are totally honest, is Ramaphosa and the ANC correct in saying that foreigners are not to blame for the situation in South Africa? Absolutely. 100% true. But that does not fix the problems and the situation in South Africa. South Africa is not a nation that can take 100, 200, 300, 500,000, or a million refugees. We're not in that position. We don't even create enough jobs for the people that live here. If you now start taking millions of refugees from other places or even hundreds of thousands, the stress levels on the infrastructure that is already crumbling as a result of the current state of South Africa is immense, right? And so, while yes, getting rid of these refugees won't fix anything, it also won't hurt. Nothing in South Africa is going to change with or without these refugees. So when someone like Fikile and Balula speak about how a lot of these refugees make South Africa a better place, he's lying. If you got rid of every single one of the refugees in South Africa wouldn't be worse. 99% of the refugees that are coming into our country are unschooled laborers. Coming to a country of, guess what? Unschooled laborers. The same argument that the European parliaments used for years and decades to try and justify their unfettered immigration from the third world does not hold in South Africa. Remember, the Europeans said, we don't have enough people who want to do unschooled labor. We need people who's willing to do unschooled labor. South Africa doesn't have that problem. In fact, we have too much unschooled labor. What we need is people who can do schooled labor. Unfortunately, our education system produces people like Peter Kriel, so schooled labor is also a non-existent factor here in South Africa, even for people who finish school. So taking in millions of migrants, it might not be making the situation much worse, but it's definitely not making the situation better. The ANC is the problem with their laws. It broke the country. Truth depends who they're loyal to. You may have missed my point. What I am saying is, looking at communism in history, every ideological solution started with a group to get rid of. It always progresses to another group. RJO, in that sense, so I wasn't disagreeing with your full statement. I was just disagreeing with the migrants, and I wasn't disagreeing necessarily with you, but rather with the more. I understand what their blame is on. So I agree with you that communists have always looked for a group to blame. But one thing that communists have also been sort of guilty of throughout history is oftentimes blaming groups for things that have nothing to do with them, right? So they'll blame the Jews for something that the Jews didn't do, or they'll blame this group for something that this group didn't do, right? Whereas here, I don't view these protests as communist protests. Because if you listen to what these protesters want, this isn't a protest for a communist. Despite, and how I know this isn't a protest for communism, is Julius Malema has desperately been trying to get this to turn into a protest for communism. Right? He's been trying to convince the March and March guys to start taking control of the of the Reserve Bank, and to take control of the mines, and to take control of white monopoly capital. Julius Malema has desperately been trying to turn this into a populist communist movement. These protesters have not mentioned a word of a political or economic system that they're interested in. They just want immigrants gone. They don't want the immigrants here because they view South Africa as incapable of taking immigrants. So where I will agree with you is, yes, communists throughout history have always tried to make some group the villain, which then gives them the power to go after that group and ultimately corrupt, right? So I think we might see communist groups take advantage of the shutdown to try and push their communism. Whether or not that's actually going to work, that remains to be seen, right? But right now, I don't observe this group as a group of communists. At least that's not what I'm seeing right now. It's so funny. All the car guards in Pretoria don't speak English or Afrikaans or any local language. Albert, I hear you. 100%. I hear you. Illegal immigration is a problem. It's not the problem. Also, it may not be communist in essence, but socialists blame the communists and vice versa. It's a leftist way of thinking. Oh, yeah, 100%. There's definitely a leftist element to it. Um, but I do think March at least, their demand is very limited in scope. Right? They just want an end to illegal immigration. They've not really attached any other demands. But you're touching on something that I warned about a little earlier. And I think what you mentioned there actually highlights it perfectly. Um, in the chaos, you can very easily see communists take control. Because remember, the original marches or protests in the Soviet Union were also not orchestrated by the Leninists. The Leninists actually sided with um, anti-Tsarist groups, and ultimately the Leninists had to kill the anti-Tsarist groups. Right, so the communists weren't enough, so they needed the anti-Tsarist groups to make up the numbers to actually lead a protest of any sort of success. Um, and you could definitely see that here in South Africa as well. You see this rise of populism and people wanting an anti-immigration thing, and now you see the communists sort of attaching themselves to this. And in fact, Jacob Zuma has done exactly that. Julius Malema has not, which is quite interesting. Julius Malema, for all of his talk of being a communist, uh, missed the track, whereas Jacob Zuma did not. Jacob Zuma is, in fact, quietly backing March and March, which I think is interesting. So you may actually see the MK try to make use of March and March to gain control, and then ultimately exact. So I'm worried about what's going to happen here. Massive crowds and buses outside the Malawi embassy in Woodmead, mainly women. People are scared. Mark, yeah, I think a lot of people are terrified. Malema said on 16 June, let us seize the mines and banks, and sang his killing song. Yeah, but Malema he's trying to rile up his communists. And I think Malema is also hoping for the same thing, where Jacob Zuma is trying to turn March and March into marchers for MK. Julius has a different plan, because remember, Julius wants this Pan-Africanist movement. So what Julius is hoping for is that his communists will seize the opportunity of March and March's chaos to start seizing the means of production. And then they can just claim that now this is our country. Before the rise of social media and smartphones, it was easier to manipulate the masses, but now the truth gets out much easier. Well, yes, but manipulation is also much easier now because you can manipulate on a mass scale, right? So yes, the truth is revealed far sooner, but you look at there's still people who believe that COVID wasn't from a lab in Wuhan. There's still people who believe that the COVID vaccine was absolutely successful and perfect. Never mind the fact that there isn't a single dose of COVID vaccine in the whole of South Africa. I mean, if it was so successful, why do we have none? Right? So some people, if people don't want to believe, they won't. Much more loyal to a Pan African idea with a fundamental hatred for the West. Truth. Migration thing is not really a leftist policy. Only example I can think of a communist government doing it was East Germany importing Vietnamese refugees because of the population flight. Command unit. So migration, you're right, right? So leftists, specifically communists, right? They believe in workers of the world unite. So they definitely don't view borders as such an important thing, which I think is why Julius Malema doesn't like that March and March is against foreigners. He would much rather have March and March be against capitalism, right? Which is why he has not endorsed him. If March and March wanted the endorsement of Julius Malema, all they have to do is down with capitalism. Julius Malema will be part of that national shutdown. So I do think you are correct on that. Um, If you ask the Labour government in the UK, Marshall Marsh is far right. Lamborghini true. There's uncontrolled migration. It's more of liberal police. Leftist communists prefer more controlled migration. Um, I would not say leftists and communists prefer more controlled migration. Von Unit, on that point, you and I are not going to agree. The liberals, like Bill Maher, for example, in the US, they accept that the border of America is a massive problem and that the border cannot remain open. It is the leftists, the communists, and the socialists, like Hassan Abi, that are demanding free and fair open borders, right? Um, just free for all, come and go as you want. So I wouldn't agree with that. I don't believe that it's liberal. In fact, it would go against the tenets of liberalism because liberalism does actually believe in the nation state. In fact, it puts the nation state as quite high on its priority. It just believes in liberal values within the nation state. Night of Justice, thank you so much for the 140 Rand donation. Really appreciate you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And you are amazing as well. Truly appreciate the donation. Um, I definitely don't believe that. Command unit. In my estimation, leftists is everything that is wrong with this world. I don't have a lot of love for liberals, just to be fair. I don't have a lot of love for them, but I do think you can build with liberals. I think you can tolerate liberals. Leftists, I am yet to see a good reason for why any leftist should be allowed to participate. And by that, I don't mean kill all the leftists. No, enslave them. As simple as that. We choose two towns in South Africa. All the leftists go there, and it's forced labor, just forever. They just work there, and we take all the money, and they get food. I mean, they wanted communism and socialism. We'll give them soup and bread, right? The state will take nice and good care of them, and the rest of us can bask in the glory of the stuff that they make. Um, yeah, I'm just giving them what they want, right? Here's your work camp, your gulag. We won't call it a gulag. We'll call it your utopia. We'll have a nice banner. Welcome to Utopia. Go in. You get the same as everyone else. A nice room, maybe like 1 meter by 1 meter. A bed with a sort of silly blanket, and you work for the state. And then the state doesn't have to tax the conservatives. The state gets all of the stuff that the leftists make that they can sell, and the conservatives don't have to pay taxes because you have a bunch of leftists doing slave labor. I like that system. Why didn't I think of that system sooner? Now that's a government system I can get behind. This is a new thing, and I think it's an astroturf after Occupy Wall Street. I remember when leftists like Bernie Sanders were against uncontrolled migration, leftist policies work even less with it. Command unit. So the thing is, if you listen to Bernie Sanders is the exact reason why leftism is an absolute cancer. It is a policy with no principle. Leftists have no principles. Even Bernie Sanders is now 100% for open borders. Right? He criticizes the deportation of Donald Trump. Um, Leftists have no principles because there's no foundation upon which their morality is built. Right? Their morality is built on nothing. Um, and that means that they can sort of, they go wherever the wind blows them. It doesn't take much to convince them of a new position. University lecturers are woke left wing in SA and most of the West. Well, Albert, think of this: they can go do hard labor in Utopiaville. They've got the degrees. I'm sure they'll be lovely company with all of their fellow leftists. Hey guys, I know I'm making a bit of a joke here, but this is genuinely how I feel about leftism. I don't believe that society can exist with socialists and leftists in it. I don't. I don't believe that they should ever be allowed or entertained to exist. This kind of communism, this is for the poors. Yeah, but that's sort of the only thing government can do, right? If government is going to try and ensure equality of outcome, the only outcome that it can ensure is an outcome of poverty. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, is there anything else that you would like to ask me before we end today's stream? We will, of course, be back tomorrow for our final stream of the week, and hopefully, do we have? There's no more public holidays this year. Well, there is probably this year, but um, this month, I mean, no, no. So yeah, we're good. No more interruptions. I was agreeing with you about leftists having no principles, but I'm just saying I don't think leftism is the origin of it. Communists and socialists outside the West mostly reject it. No, I think so. The origins of it um, is a so it is the evolution of communism. Command unit. So the idea for communists is bring in a helper, right? We need to defeat the conservatives. We need to bring in someone that can help us fight the conservatives. What they, of course, don't understand is that those that they're bringing in will become their biggest nightmare, but that they don't understand. So the communists, I think, had to adapt their policy because you are correct. Historically, communists weren't very much for open borders, right? In fact, um, the the Berlin Wall, wasn't really policed on the German side, the West German side, but it was heavily policed on the East German side. Right, and the idea there wasn't to really stop people from getting in because no one wanted to get in. It was to stop the people from getting out. But they also didn't allow a lot of people to get in, right? Because they're always super afraid of spies and sort of people who want to work against the movement. So you are absolutely correct in that. But remember, if I have an enemy inside my country that needs to be defeated, but I don't have the means of defeating that enemy, then I need someone that can. And since leftism and communism is largely policies driven by women, specifically white middle aged women, and soy boys or very feminine men, who the hell is going to fight the conservatives? Right? You think a femboy that spent his entire life trying to figure out how to do his nails perfectly is going to pick up a gun and fight a conservative guy? No, right? And I think that's fundamentally the problem. They identified that they need soldiers, and so they thought, "Hey, we'll just bring in these Middle Eastern men, and they'll be the soldiers, and we can deal with them later." Of course, none of them saw the history or rate the history of Iran, because the last time communists thought that, hey, we can side with these Muslims, the Muslims killed all the communists and just took control. So that's probably also going to happen. Why, that was so funny. Why, thank you very much. I think it's funny because most people know it's true. He will throw his high heels. That's just, yeah, probably. Although I do remember back in my gaming days, uh, a yeah, it was like a guy that I met on in one of the guilds in WoW. He was a femboy, or he said he was a femboy, and he actually told me that femboys are mostly right wing. So maybe they don't even have the femboys. Maybe it's just the soy boys. I don't know. I don't know exactly. Oh no, they're not right wing. They're Nazis. Like apparently there's like a huge Nazi movement inside the femboy movement. So I don't know. Maybe they don't even have that. Maybe they just have the middle aged white woman. Texas is warm. Werner, how you doing, sir? Denk Durban is in Noord, maar anders is dit te ver baie lekker. Werner, explain to where you need it, man. Elon worked hard for his businesses. Oh yeah, not learn any lessons from Iran. Those because communists don't learn. I mean, if they could learn anything from anything, history would have taught them that communism and socialism doesn't work. But it's a belief that it's a belief that exists in idealism, and idealism is terrible for rational thought. Is your powder dry? Post the ammunition and praise the Lord. Mark, yep. I hope Cena is wrong, but my confirmation bias falls the other way at this moment. I don't think Cena is wrong. I think that is coming. I think a lot of people are misinterpreting Cena because, as I said to you guys before, I think Seer van Rensburg was a seer, and I do believe that God showed him, visions of the future. But um, I think our own interpretations of seer is where things go very wrong. Because I can tell you now, I've spoken to multiple people who think they know everything that there is to know about Seer, and everyone has their own opinion on the things that he saw. I say, well, everyone can't be right. That's the problem. Ek het afgeneem, ek moet seker weer aan die werk spring. Jaguar, thank you so much, man. Ek waardeer dat jy kom hallo sê. Um geluk met die of sterkte met die werk rather. Dit is so moeilik vir my om Afrikaans te praat op video. I mean, dit voel awkward. En tog, ek is Afrikaans. Ek kan Afrikaans praat. En as ek Afrikaans praat op 'n video is dit amper asof my brein net gaan, nee, wag, hierdie het gebreek. Wat doen jy? Jy praat verkeerd nou. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure why I struggle so much with Afrikaans on video, but I do. I'll have to Google what a femboy is, but don't want to mess up my algorithm. Albert, I would not Google that. Uh, I'll give you a quick, so you know what a trans woman is, right? A man that thinks he's a woman and then starts pumping himself full of hormones and stuff. So a femboy is usually young, 17, 18, 19, maybe 20 at the most. Don't want to be a woman, but want to be super feminine. So they almost become the caricature of if you were to try and explain to an alien what a woman is, they become the caricature of what a woman is. Right? So they sort of go over the top with everything. In I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on YouTube, but in Afrikaans we used to call them moffies. You know what I mean, right? That's the that's the that's sort of the best example or the best explanation I have of it. It's guys that super like they go over the top with their feminine or female what they think a woman is, right? So how they think a woman would talk, how they think a woman would react in things. Um, Actually, a great example of it would be do you guys remember in Orkney Snorkney, Casper de Vries? I don't know if you guys remember it, but Casper de Vries in Orkney Snorkney, that's sort of what a femboy is. Was those mimic young women? Yeah, obviously. Raised into being a family by single mothers. I don't know what exactly is the origin of it or where it comes from. I just know that it is Pride Month in Iran is off the chain. Oh yeah, they're throwing people off buildings, celebrating, and it's a hoot in Iran. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, I still have to go buy food and I still have to make a video for tomorrow morning. Although I'm still researching the video, so I'm not entirely sure what is if I'm gonna make the video today or make it tomorrow morning. think leftism has its place as a political thought. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. I honestly hate liberalism more because honestly, I never see remorse from liberals. I would not. I think leftism is a cancer. Come on, we can talk about it tomorrow during stream. Happening in the UK, little girls are now aware grooming issue and woke lefties telling them otherwise. So we discussed that particular topic we discussed right at the beginning of the stream, right? So you can just go back and listen to the full discussion of that topic. But I'm gonna go, ladies and gentlemen. I truly appreciate all of you for coming out, for hanging out with me, for spending time with me. Again, a massive thank you to Justice for your donation. Uh, Truly appreciate that. It is fan funding and memberships that allow me to do the stuff that I do. So thank you so much to all of you that are members of this channel, those of you that donate to the channel. I truly cannot say thank you enough. Let me just make sure that no one donated on Stub. No, we good. So I didn't miss saying thank you to everyone. Truly appreciate you, ladies and gentlemen. As always, be good to each other, be kind to each other, and I will see all of you in the next one. Peace.